Well, first of all, I want to give thanks for the kind invitation I have received from the University of Toruń to participate in this wonderful conference sponsored by the Laboratory of Religious Freedom. Particularly, I want to give thanks to Professor Piotr Rozak, Sasha Horvath, Alexandra Vaney, and all the organizing committee for their kindness and effort in preparing this conference. As David has said, it is an enormous honor to be invited to talk about religious freedom in this wonderful land of witnesses of religious freedom, from St. John Paul II the Great to St. Maximilian Kolbe, not to speak of the Jews murdered during the Holocaust. The topic of the conference is really a timely one: challenges to religious identity in public life between art and medicine. We are facing difficult times for religious freedom all over the world, not only in communist regimes or Sharia dictatorships. I come from Spain, from a well-established Western democracy, and it should be dishonest to deny that in our so-called open societies, we face crucial challenges for religious freedom. We should not commit ourselves to the task, I think, of taking the speck of our neighbor's eye and fail to see the plank in our own eyes. In the time that follows, I prepare to reflect upon the paradoxes concerning free speech and discrimination in our Western democracies. I do not deny, of course, the hardships suffered in closed regimes under the rule of Sharia, nor the oppression experienced by communist countries. And I'm not unaware about that, but the very notion of ordo amoris, which is the basis of any practical, either ethical or political duty, demands us a primary concern about our own house with its own dangers. The title of my lecture, From Je suis Charlie to the Phobic Hysteria, Paradoxes of Free Speech, gives me an occasion to start with two stories. Probably you know, for sure you know the first one, and probably you know also the second one. On Wednesday, January 7, 2015, two terrorists murdered 12 people and severely damaged 11 more in the headquarters of the satirical weekly magazine Charlie Hebdo. The murder, whose authorship was claimed by Al-Qaeda, immediately produced a profound international shock. Just 1 hour after the crime, a French citizen published a tweet, Je suis Charlie, that achieved success in internet and became one of the most popular tweets in its history. Millions of people repeated the phrase, which penetrated the public spaces all over the world in posters and demonstration slogans. For a few days, the Je suis Charlie became the international banner of freedom of speech. At the same time, critical voices emerged observing that there was something going wrong with the motto, that willy-nilly it expressed something more beyond the due solidarity with the victims. Blasphemous and extremely offensive, the cartoons published by Charlie Hebdo began to be displayed in the mass media, and many people lost their sympathy for the victims of the attacks. A new voice saying, Je ne suis pas Charlie, expressed a critical reaction against the way the solidarity with the magazine had been channeled. Among the critics, David Brooks in the New York Times, or Brian Clough from the University of Oxford. Even Pope Francis included a reference to the limits of free speech in the condemnation of the attacks. My second story took place just 4 years after the first one. In the month of January 2019, a group of students of Oxford University promoted a campaign to collect signatures in change.org, asking for the removal of Professor John Finnis. one of the most prominent legal philosophers in the world, and perhaps the best English speaker proponent of natural law in the field of jurisprudence, accusing him of homophobia and transphobia. In support of their accusations, they quoted a series of texts in which Finis had advocated for the traditional classical view of marriage and disqualified, as opposed to the common good of marriage, any form of sexual activity outside that institution. The proposal of these students managed to produce some sensation, and it was soon followed by more than 300 people. The emeritus professor responded by holding fast to his writings. The petition, Finis declared to the Oxford student, travesties my position and my testimony in American constitutional litigation. I stand by all these writings. There is not a phobic sentence in them. The 1994 essay promotes a classical and strictly philosophical moral critique of all non-marital sex acts and has been republished many times, most recently by Oxford University Press in the 3rd volume of my collected essays. After a few days, Finis denounced in The Guardian that his critics mistakenly took arguments against their positions and choices to be offensive to them as persons, a problem that became worse by paraphrases and mutilated quotations. Again, he stood firm in his viewpoint, and he even added that it is clearer than ever to me that the position I have been criticizing are damaging to children and other vulnerable people and to the sustainability of societies. Finally, Finis concluded by saying that freedom of expression was threatened by recent notions of hate speech, phobia, and so forth. A year and a half after the incident, Professor Finis gave an interview in which he warned about the creation of thought crimes. I was beyond being damaged, he said, but the younger academics, they would have got the message. Nowadays, to become a judge or to go to the bar, you have to answer questions that may include these one. There will be ways of making it become apparent that you may hold these views and are therefore unsuitable. These two stories are examples to illustrate a current trend toward legitimizing religious offense in the first place, and a trend toward canceling traditional Orthodox views as unorthodox in the second place. The two tendencies present us with a striking paradox that deserves strong remarks. First, let me talk a little bit about the origins of this paradox. I will call it the paradox of liberal anti-authoritarianism. And it has to do with a contradiction we should be warned about. Particularly since the 1960s, a strong movement against any traditional instance of moral authority has gained an increasing support in the West. The belief in a self-constituted individual, endowed with a pure freedom and unrestrained by any moral conditioning, was extended, and freedom was used as a weapon to erode traditional institutional bonds. Very soon, however, the drop of traditional authority was accompanied by the rise of a new, diffuse, and anonymous authority. It was the emergence of the so-called political correctness. To understand this change, we must consider that the very phenomenon of authority belongs to the essence of the public sphere. We cannot get rid of it. It is something as real as the air that we breathe. Moral authority is a political need deeply ingrained in our nature as social beings necessitated of familiarity and recognition. The attack on moral authority perpetrated in 1968 and beyond was fully unable to suppress authority as such. As I have said, it could only undermine the traditional sources of authority, but it could not fulfill its utopian goal, interdit d'interdire, it is prohibited to prohibit. It could not attain that goal. Undermining the spiritual authority of the church and the family could only create a vacuum that necessarily had to be filled by another source of authority. Such new source is what we call political correctness. In the words of Leonidas Donskis, public opinion research, questionnaires, telephone polls, and obsessively counted ratings are what create authority at what themselves constitute an anonymous, diffused authority. Of course, we could add many more diffuse instances of even lesser pedigree, TV shows, celebrity statements, etc. It goes without saying that in the last 2 decades, the fluidity of political correctness has been intensified due to the rise of communication technologies. My second remark concerns what I call the transition from a deconstructive liberalism to an authoritarian liberalism. First, let me note that, as we know, the term liberalism is quite ambiguous. I will not refer now to classical liberalism or limited government liberalism, which is a noble aspiration that traces back at least to the Middle Ages, notably to the Magna Carta and so forth. Contemporary liberalism, however, almost invariably postulates the freedom of the individual to define his own version of what we can call the good life. From this perspective, human rights and liberties have been invoked as a means for undermining the common traditional understandings of the good life in the conscience of individuals. Therefore, they have operated as a deconstructive liberalism. In the last decade, however, this deconstructive liberalism is being replaced by a new authoritarian liberalism. The new liberalism purports to restrict traditional freedoms by imposing the whole citizenship a duty to endorse and publicly confess the validity and even the nobility of the beliefs and lifestyles held by others. However, if holding a particular lifestyle, for example, homosexual activity, if that is incompatible with one's own lifestyle, for example, a chaste life under the Catholic beliefs or one's own ideals, so to speak, how is it possible not to intrude in one's own lifestyle by imposing him or her, a person, an endorsement or acceptance of an incompatible lifestyle? To the extent that I am imposed such beliefs, liberalism becomes authoritarian. A third remark I would like to make has to do with the reasons why relativistic liberalism has become authoritarian. What are the reasons? How it has become authoritarian? If what I have called relativistic liberalism has ultimately become authoritarian, there must be something in the deep values or ideas sponsored by relativistic liberalism that is not liberal at all, that is deeply illiberal from the very beginning. Relativistic liberalism, both in its deconstructive stage and in its authoritarian stage, cannot be about freedom. If it were so, it would not have an authoritarian stage. In its deconstructive stage, relativistic liberalism defends a right to do wrong in the name of freedom and tolerance. In its authoritarian stage, relativistic liberalism imposes the wrong it used to defend as a right. This time, however, it does not invoke the good life, but the new values. Who cares is its first slogan. Teaching diversity is its second one. Relativistic and authoritarian liberalism are successive stages in the corrupted forms of states, magisteriously described by Plato in Book 8 of the Republic. In a relativistic society, and I quote Plato, if someone tells him, the individual, that some pleasures are the result of fine and good desires, others are of evil desires, and that he should follow and value the first and punish and hold in subjection the second, he does not admit this truth or allow it into the fortress. He shakes his head at any claims of this sort, saying that all desires are equal and must be valued equally. Plato is talking about education, unquote. For, I quote again, there is no controlling order in the life of the man who puts equality before everything, unquote. This state of affairs, as Plato rightly explains, immediately precedes tyranny. Is it the insatiable longing for this good, freedom, and the neglect of everything else, which brings about a change in this regime too, and creates the need for tyranny? Says Socrates. How does that happen? Interrogates Adeimantus. And Socrates concludes, I imagine it is when a democracy, in its thirst for the wine of freedom, finds the wine being poured by unscrupulous cupbearers, and when it drinks more deeply than it should of pure, unmixed freedom, then if its magistrates are not totally easygoing and do not offer in that freedom in large quantities, it accuses them of being filthy oligarchs and punishes them. In a society of this sort, teachers are afraid of their pupils and curry favor with them. Pupils have an equal contempt for their teachers and their attendants. In general, the young are the image of their elders and challenge them in everything they say and do. The old descend to the level of the young. They pepper everything with wit and humor, trying to be like the young, because they don't want to be thought harsh or dictatorial. It's all like that, all full of freedom, certainly headstrong, said Adeimantus. But what is the next step, he added. Indeed, excesses in one direction generally tends to produce a violent reaction in the opposite direction. This is true of seasons of the year, of plants and animals, and particularly true of political regimes. Here do we find the origin of tyranny, the harshest and most complete slavery arising, I guess, from the most extreme freedom. Well, so far, the picture I have portrayed may be seen as somewhat discouraging, but we should not let us be deceived by an ill-grounded optimism. Semper dies mali in seculo, semper dies boni in Deo, said Augustine. We do not need to develop a long catalog of reasons in order to be happy and keep fighting for the truth. A few ultimate reasons are more than enough. Therefore, in what follows, if I have some time, could I have a little bit more? I would want to go beyond the diagnose and state 4 theses to disentangle the paradox of free speech and to clarify a little bit the scope and limits of legitimate free speech. My first thesis concerns the so-called right to insult, defended by some scholars in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attack and currently invoked to justify blasphemous and offensive art. Just 1 year before his death, Wesley Hoffel published in the Yale Law Journal his famous Fundamental Legal Conceptions, one of the most notable contributions to legal analysis written in the first half of the 20th century. This work was the culmination of an ambitious project and has given rise to an impressive amount of literature. Hoffel distinguished what he called claim rights from another kind of rights that he labeled privileges or liberty rights. A's claim right is the correlate of B's duty. For example, the duty not to prevent A from doing something. A is having a right or claim to X against B entails B's having the corresponding duty to X against A. For example, if I have a claim to receive 10,000 zlotys from Alexandra, for example, it would be great. That means that Alexandra has a duty to give me 10,000 zlotys. By contrast, the privilege or liberty right is nothing but the denial of an opposite duty on the side of the liberty holder. Thus, A's having a privilege or liberty to X opposes to A's having a duty not to X. If I have a liberty right to express my opinion here in front of this auditorium, that means that I do not have a duty to refrain from expressing my opinion here. The paradox here is that when people defend a right to do wrong or to offend, they are manipulating language or confusing liberty right with a claimed right sometimes, at most. There cannot exist a moral or human liberty right to do something wrong for the very reason that there always exists a moral or human duty not to do wrong. However, a claimed right not to be prevented from doing something wrong may exist, but it would be just a derivation of a social moral duty of tolerance of certain evils. It could never be justified in the moral autonomy of freedom of the right holder, but it would be the mere correlate of a duty of tolerance in order to avoid worse evils. If society tolerates certain insults, for example, the repugnant utterances of Charlie Hebdo, or other offensive expressions, the reason to do it does not lie in the moral autonomy or in the legitimate freedom of Charlie Hebdo or other rascals, but in the risks that could follow from banning Charlie Hebdo's behavior. The very notion of free speech as a moral freedom, grounded in moral autonomy, however, cannot cover insult. My second thesis can be summarized in the following statement. The main reasons for banning insult and religious offenses should not be the protection of public peace or public safety, but the honor of the offended. Well, I have talked about this in my previous intervention. Basically, the reason is that that creates a discrimination. So I can skip this point. My third thesis is simple. In a pluralistic society, ideological censure is unacceptable, particularly in public universities and public research. This would require some nuance in the case of private institutions with a particular ideology. Here, I want to be very brief. I'll quote Chief Justice Earl Warren in the judgment suis versus New Hampshire. The essentiality of freedom in the community of universities is almost self-evident. No one should underestimate the vital role in a democracy that is played by those who guide and train our youth. To impose any straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of our nation. No field of education is so thoroughly comprehended by man that new discoveries cannot yet be made. Particularly is that true in the social sciences, where few, if any, principles are accepted as absolutes. Scholarship cannot flourish in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. Well, I go to the next point. Basically, in this point I will also add that when in the private institutions this is somewhat different, or in institutions in which they have an official, established, well-known ideology and legitimate ideology. In a pluralistic society, the state couldn't endorse such an ideology, cannot indoctrinate. But in sectarian institutions, it is legitimate to impose restrictions on free speech due to the public expectations that everybody understand in that institution, that everybody acquiesce to admit in that institutions. And finally, my fourth thesis concerns the use of apostrophes such as the suffix phobic or categories such as hate speech. Basically, we should reject them as ideologically biased. That's my claim. In a recent work published in the context of current attacks to free speech in American campuses, Princeton constitutional scholar Keith Whittington has rightly pointed out that though the category of hate speech is sometimes framed narrowly to focus on threats, harassments, and personal insults, it is often framed very broadly to include arguments with unpleasant conclusions. In the same direction, the US Supreme Court has explicitly asserted the right of students to express any viewpoint they wish, including a discriminatory one, in line with the court's tradition of protecting the freedom to express the thought that we hate. In other judgment, the Supreme Court of the United States has explained that the government may not regulate speech based on hostility or favoritism towards a non-proscribable message they contain. The contrast between vague ideologically charged concepts like hate speech or the phobic suffix is very strong. There is a strong contrast with the clear traditional categories of slander, injury, or insult on the one hand, and calumny on the other hand. Of course, we may also find borderline cases with regards to these traditional categories. However, they are less ideologically charged and more peacefully tailored than the ethereal concept of hate speech and the phobic level. We must not find striking the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States has never recognized a special category of hate speech that is excluded from First Amendment protection. And the same applies to the so-called phobic discourse. As Nadine Strozen has pointed out, this does not mean, of course, that all speech connoted by the vague phrase hate speech is constitutionally protected. It just means that the concept of hate speech is not an appropriate category to exclude the constitutional protection provided by the First Amendment. And this is the end of my intervention. Let me just give thanks again to the organization and to our strict moderator, to a friendly moderator. She has given me extra minutes, so I'm really thankful, and thankful to all of you for your attention and for your kind attention, and thanks again to the Laboratory of Religious Freedom.